Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Delivering Dunamis podcast, where we are inspiring transformation through the strength and the power of the Almighty. I'm your host, Matthew Deibler, and today, the message that I have to share with you is you are not supposed to see the whole staircase. Recently, I had the opportunity to launch my first book. The title is The Devil and the Children of God at the End of the World. Remarkably, the response was so strong in the first few days following its release that I quickly achieved a #1 bestseller status on Amazon, specifically in the adult Christian ministry category. It was a humbling moment for me. I was overwhelmed with gratitude. My journey, it's hard for me to even process in my natural mind how God led me to this point. And I want to talk about that a little bit today, because you need to know where I was, and you can get the in-depth details of this story in my book. It is very transparent, and I believe that it's a very powerful and engaging read. So I encourage you to pick up a copy as you have time. But I want, for the sake of this podcast, to go back and talk a little bit about where I was when this whole transformation process began. So looking back to the year 2011, I've spoken about this before. This was a very devastating time in my life. I had just come out of a bad breakup, and I was overwhelmed with stress and anxiety, and I actually was led to a nervous breakdown. That nervous breakdown then guided me into the captivity of agoraphobia, because I became very fearful about leaving my comfort zone out of the fear that I could potentially encounter another nervous breakdown while out in public. And so, if I was standing in line at a grocery store, for example, and I had to wait a couple of minutes to check out, I would often abandon the cart and run out of the store, because the anxiety within me would become so strong, so intense, that it was sort of inevitable. I was either going to experience a panic attack, or perhaps even worse, as my mind, began to race, I thought maybe this panic attack will be the one that sends me into another situation like the one that I had experienced, just weeks or months before, where I would have that complete nervous breakdown and I'd wind up in a hospital. So I'd often run out of those public places just in complete terror of the what if. And as I began to restrict my travel, my mobility outside of the four walls of my apartment, those walls, they just began to close in on me. And everyday tasks just grew harder and harder to accomplish. Simple things: going to the mailbox, taking out the trash. They were all very daunting challenges for me, because it was often, all I needed to do was step towards the door, and the rush of anxiety that would flood my body would be so overwhelming. I would feel as though my throat was constricted. I would feel as though I was going to pass out. My heart would just race uncontrollably. I would shake. It was a very, very dark and vulnerable place. So, as I've shared before, it was in this season that I met God. Now, I had a little knowledge of him. I grew up in the church, but I really had no relationship with him prior to this time in my life. So he came in and he really intervened in a profound way to set me on a path towards healing. And, you know, I couldn't deny his presence. And when I began seeking him for wisdom, for clarity, for direction, he started to make his voice more known to me. I started to feel his nudge. Things began to happen that that really set me on the right track. That being said, I was very stubborn. I often wanted to do everything in my own strength. And it was hard for me to allow God in and give him complete control over my circumstances. But eventually I got to a point where I exhausted everything I knew and I really felt like there was no other way out. So in that brokenness, I actually fell to my knees. And this was, 6 months after I reconvened with God and started drawing nearer to him. But it was 6 months or so more of that suffering in the darkness before I finally, fell at his feet and gave my life to him wholeheartedly. Because I was at rock bottom and I was ready to die. I didn't want to take my life. I wasn't suicidal, but I was ready to go. And I was basically telling God, hey, if you're ready to take me, I'm ready to go. If you're not, well, I'm not going to take my own life, but I need you to take my life and do something with it. Do something with my life according to your will, because I can't figure this out on my own. And that's what he started doing. That's when I was given the affirmation, let go, trust, believe, faith, which I've also spoken about before. And, step by step, he led me out of that captivity of agoraphobia and allowed me to find freedom again. I was often reminded of one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King, where he states, you don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step in faith. And again, that's sort of the message I want to share with you today. We're not supposed to see the whole staircase. If we could, we would get far too involved. It would shock us. Our natural minds could not begin to process God's plan for the future. And if we could process it, then that plan would not be his. I hope that makes sense. His wisdom is so far beyond anything that the human mind can absorb. That's why it's so critical that we live our lives truly in faith. Faith means taking the first step without being able to see the whole staircase. If you could see it, well, that wouldn't require any faith at all. None. And in all honesty, if you could, how much would you get involved with it? And how would that lead you away from God? There were moments in that agoraphobic captivity that it was hard for me to even think about how I would ever again do simple tasks in my community. I mean, we're talking about, how would I go get my hair cut and sit in a barber's chair comfortably again? Like, how would I go sit in a movie theater again? All of these things were, it's when you're in that state of darkness, they seem overwhelmingly intimidating because the fear has just robbed you of any joy of living. So it would have been extraordinarily hard for me to process the idea that in a few months' time, I'd be out running 100 miles in a month. In 6 months' time, I would be traveling all the way across the country again on an airplane with a new love interest, a woman who would become my wife many years later. I mean, in the space I was in, how was I going to have any relationship of value? How was I ever going to go and get on an airplane? I could barely get in my car and drive to the local McDonald's, let alone sit still on a flight in a very confined space for 6 hours. If I allowed myself to try and process all of that from that space of captivity, I would have essentially paralyzed myself because I would have just said, there's no way. It's too much. It's overwhelming. And I would have just stalled, would have been stuck. But with God involved in my life, I didn't really need to look that far ahead. I didn't need to look a month out. I didn't need to look a week out. All I needed to do was live in the moment in the day that he had gifted me. And what was involved with that was just stepping forward in faith, literally one step at a time. I lived the quote from Martin Luther King. You don't have to see the whole staircase. Just take the first step and put it on repeat. As I approached the doorway to exit my home and head towards the mailbox, taking the first step in faith, repeating his affirmation over and over again in my brain. And inch by inch, I moved my way further away from my comfort zone. And as my confidence began to rise, as God began to empower his strength within me, I started to do a little more. Each and every day, I did a little more, I went a little further. And before I knew it, I had run a couple, 100 miles in a very short period of time. I had gotten back on airplanes. I had met my wife and started enjoying the opportunity to go out and date again with her, have dinners at restaurants and go to movies and just experience what the world had to offer us. Those things were so foreign to me just a few months earlier. But God, He wanted to liberate me. He wanted to free me from the captivity of that fear. I couldn't have figured it out in my head, but just by stepping forward, one foot in front of the other, each and every day, in faith, miracles began to unfold in my life. That's what this is all about. We all want to see miracles in our lives, in the lives of those we care about. It's something that truly ignites our faith because it leads us into this space of just tremendous gratitude. And it really allows us to trust God in such a profound way. But I think often we neglect to acknowledge the miracles because they happen as a result of a series of committed steps in faith. And don't get me wrong, I mean, there are miracles. I was just listening to a podcast today. A woman who, was in prayer after receiving diagnosis of a cancerous tumor, had hands laid on her and prayer given, went back in for her checkup, cancerous tumor is gone. There are miracles like that happen, but there are also miracles that unfold over a period of time as a result of, those committed steps forward in faith. When I got, 6 months down the road after turning my life over to God, I could look back and say, oh my goodness, what a miracle. The day to day, it was just truly, an inch by inch type of process. Looking back, though, in a very short period of time, in the grand scheme of things, I had gone from complete captivity to living my life in complete freedom. Thanks be to God. It's amazing. From there, well, I went on a road of, spiritual peaks and valleys. I encountered some very dark things on that path. And if you'd like to read more about those encounters, you can find them in my book, The Devil and the Children of God at the End of the World. 2 encounters with Satan during that time. But God had redeemed my life back in 2011. And when He did, He gave me the Holy Spirit. And even when I was stubborn and resisting in my own will, when I was turning away from God, the Holy Spirit was always there. I found that when I was spiritually tuned in, when I was seeking its guidance, then its voice became magnified. I felt the nudges were, much stronger in that space. When I turned away, well, it may have diminished a bit. It was a bit of a whisper. And actually, there was a period of my life where I felt I didn't hear anything at all. That was a season of spiritual maturity. I call it my time in the wilderness. God was sharpening and molding me so that I could prepare myself for the future mission that I would fulfill for his kingdom. In these peaks and valleys, the call is the same. One step forward in faith and put it on repeat. If you do that, if you trust that he's there with you, that his love endures, that he is by your side through all things, even the dark seasons, if you trust that he is there, you can withstand whatever you are facing. And you can continue to move in the direction of his will. You can't always know where he is leading you. Again, you're not supposed to. You are not supposed to have visibility to the plan. If you knew, you would likely get too involved and you'd screw it up, because that's what we do. We're humans. Our desires get involved. What if he showed you something that you weren't prepared to handle? It was too much. You'd doubt yourself. You'd feel inadequate. What if it was something that you didn't believe aligned with what you wanted to do in life? What if it was a completely different calling? What if it was a completely different career path or, skill that you were going to need to learn? What if God was about to bring something into your life that was completely foreign to you, but he was going to give you the strength and the power to excel at it? If you knew that it was coming, you might get wrapped up in the fear of how you would handle it. And again, that would paralyze you. You'd be back to captivity. You'd stop stepping forward in faith. So it's best that you don't see it all. That is intentional. He wants us to walk by faith and not by sight. I came from a place where my life truly, if you could have been a fly on the wall in that apartment while I was just totally consumed by anxiety, if you could have seen the horror that I faced throughout the night when I would wake up 4 to 5 times in panic, when I would spend the entire night awake because I was fearful about going to sleep, when I would struggle mightily to do the things that I needed just to take care of my basic needs. If you could have seen that, if you could have been the fly on the wall, you would never, ever imagine that I would be where I am today, that I would have written a book that became a #1 bestseller on Amazon, that I would be hosting a podcast, that I would be proclaiming the truth boldly on outlets all over social media. And you know what? I wouldn't have been able to process it either. Thankfully, I didn't worry about where exactly God was taking me. I just gave my life to him. And day by day, 24 hours at a time, he led me here. The whole way through, my destination was secure. I had no reason to fear, no reason to hesitate. And what he delivered in the end is nothing short of an absolute miracle. After the book launch, after the bestseller recognition, I spent a lot of time just sitting and processing the emotions of it all. I shed a lot of tears. I fell to my knees and I thanked God. I was literally hanging on by a thread a decade ago. My life had seemingly ended. I was so incredibly broken. But God came in and he decided that he could work with the brokenness, that he could give me new life, new hope at a time when my own hope had been completely lost. I was ready to surrender, but he had a bigger plan in mind. And in order for that plan to take shape, he just needed me to step forward in faith. No, Matthew, you do not need to see the whole staircase. You are not supposed to see the whole staircase. If you could see where I'm taking you, you wouldn't be ready for it. Even today, because when I look at this, I don't by any means believe that I have arrived. The Christian journey is always evolving. I'm still tempted. The flesh still gets to me at times. And I still am in need of forgiveness. I still sin. Every day, I need to make a committed effort to ground myself in faith. I need to ask the Holy Spirit to guide my steps. I ask God to come into my life and shepherd me every single day. And I ask his voice to be magnified through me. This is all about giving me the strength to continue to put one foot in front of the other in his will. Because sometimes the more that I've empowered his will, the more that I've empowered the Holy Spirit and its voice in my life, the more that I've surrendered to that and have been obedient to the call, the more he's given me. And the more that he's given me, the more at times in my flesh, I could be vulnerable to feeling, intimidated or overwhelmed or awkward about, stepping into an area unknown to me. But again, I'm not supposed to see the whole staircase. I'm not supposed to figure out how it all comes together. I'm just supposed to step forward. That's it. I've found over the last couple of years that he's taught me how to do things that, quite honestly, I never had any exposure to before, and I didn't believe that I had the skills to take on. But when I've done it and it's in line with his will, when I've just, tried to invite those types of opportunities in, he's lighted the path for me. It's amazing. So don't get bogged down in planning, in the expectation that you can look too far ahead, because if you're living according to God's will, the likelihood is you're not going to be able to see anything beyond what's right in front of you, and that is intentional. It's about, truly setting aside your desires to live in his. And he likes to reveal those desires to us in, segments, in pieces that we can effectively consume. Because if he gave it all to us at once, if he showed us the whole path, like I said, we'd screw that up. The miracles that you desire will take shape if you just give him the keys and allow him to drive. I can't tell you how many miracles that I've experienced over the last decade, and the fact that I'm even here is one. Beating agoraphobia, meeting my wife, having beautiful children, finding purpose, helping people, serving, writing a book, starting a podcast. It's all absolutely remarkable, but you need to understand the backstory. You have to understand where I was to truly appreciate it. And that's why I boldly share my testimony, and that's why I went so deep into my story in my book, because I think that's really what highlights God's transformational power, his dunamis power. And that's what is available to all of us if we seek it. And I want to make that known to the world. You're not supposed to see the whole staircase. So let go of that desire. Just go where he nudges you, one step at a time, 24 hours at a time. And you will be amazed by where it leads. And someday you'll turn and you'll look back and say, my goodness, God, how did you do this? What an absolute miracle you've delivered to my life. God bless you all.